welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this Saturday. My name is Monique Henry Hudson. I am the co-founder of Diverse Toons, and I am so excited that this is our first live artist web demo, and it's featuring Danny Williams, who is amazing artist. Like, we had a run through earlier this week, and just him breaking down the stuff of what he was going to be showing today was very exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Danny in. Hey, Danny.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay?
I believe they can. I can hear you.
Okay, great. Hopefully people can hear us. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Andre Rodriguez for connecting us. Yeah, I know he's worked with you guys in the past a lot.
Yes. So also, real quick before you start, can you just give a brief background about yourself,
Sure.
where you're from, and maybe like some of the places that you've worked at?
Yep, sure. I'm from New York. I grew up in the Bronx. I started my career at Blue Sky Studios a long, long time ago. I stayed there for 11 years and then moved out to the West Coast to work on video games for the first time at a company called ArenaNet, and then went down to DreamWorks for 5 years. And then sadly, about almost, almost 6 years ago, my brother-in-law passed away, and we needed to move back to New York to be closer to family again. And we moved back to upstate New York, where I went to go work for Activision Blizzard. They have a studio here called Vicarious Visions, and I was there until January. So I was there 5 years, and now I'm working remote again for DreamWorks again,
Oh, okay.
which is great.
Cool.
Yeah,
Cool. So that's a little bit background about Danny. Danny, I'm gonna let you take it away.
sure. All right. So before we get into the live demo, I don't want to waste a bunch of time and I've worked on this or whatever. You guys can look up what I've worked on. We don't need to do all of that. Basically, what I wanted to talk to you about is sort of the way I work. Most of my career, I've been a modeler. Occasionally, I also help out with visual development, and I love to draw and I love to sculpt. And those are the two things as a kid that really sort of fascinated me. What I didn't have as a kid was sort of what I think this this system, Diverse Tunes, provides for you guys. I didn't have anybody to tell me, hey, here are the people who make these movies or games or the things that you like, to look at and experience. I didn't know that this was possible. They just sort of plopped down out of the ether. So having something like this where you can see people sort of talk about their experience is, I think, pretty great. So I'm not sure where people are in terms of your level of familiarity with some of the tools that we're going to use. We're going to touch Photoshop, Sketchbook Pro. Uh, we're going to touch ZBrush a lot for digital sculpting. And then at the end, probably a little bit of Substance Painter and Marmoset Toolbag, just so you can sort of see all the tools that I use for different tasks. And the tasks I normally get are take someone else's idea in the form of a 2D drawing and convert that into a model, or sometimes even as broad as here are written words on a page, and then take that and turn that into something that we can use to pitch either as 2D art or 3D art to make a pitch to get funding to, make a project possible. So the sculpture part is where we'll spend most of our time. That's where I have most of my experience. And there's a few things before we get started that I want to make sure we talk about, right? And the way that I try to think about these things, so hierarchy is super important. And this is probably the part of the demo where people will space out a little bit and not really pay attention, but I promise this is where the best information is in everything I'm going to tell you. So hierarchy is, the big shapes come first, right? If you think about it as smaller shapes live inside of big shapes, and then even smaller shapes live inside of those smaller shapes. So hierarchy is the biggest, most important thing. If you can't nail the things that you see from far away in your sculpt, it doesn't matter how much detail and little noodly stuff you add on top, because the big shapes are what communicate most to us. And here's a trick. When you think about appeal, one of the things that relates to sort of appeal, think about an appealing model, sculpture, drawing, painting, whatever, where there's not a clear hierarchy. It's hard to think about, right? Because one of the tricks to appeal is in our own narcissism, is in the way that we think. We like feeling rewarded when we look at a thing. And one of the ways that we trick ourselves into feeling rewarded is when you feel smart, when you feel like you understand a thing. When things are clear and visibly really easy to understand, it actually triggers a chemical, right? It triggers an endorphin, and you go, oh, I feel good when I see this. And that's what people mean by appeal. So clarity of form is really important, and hierarchy is a good way to get there, right? So hierarchy is the most important thing. Work big to small as much as you can. The next thing is cross section, right? So if you were to cut the model at any point, if you were to slice it, do you understand and are you in control of what that shape is at the point where you slice it, right? So my forearm, if I were to cut right through right here, what is that shape exactly? And does that shape change if my forearm twists, right? And it does. So there's all kinds of things that you need to understand, not really down to the level of anatomy. I used to, at different points in my life, sort of know the name of each bone and what it's called, where they connect, and I have since lost all that information. And I've realized the important part is understanding the shapes and the way the shapes work, right? So cross section is really, really important. And then relationships. There's lots of ways to think about relationships. Um, what I mean by relationships is sort of picking one thing as your flagship point and then moving out from there and saying, okay, well, how many eyes across is the whole head? How many eyes high is the whole head? You're using the eye as a measurement. So you probably are happy with the eye and don't want to change it. But if you're being honest and using that as a measurement point, you can sort of look and see different relationships. And it's not just about measuring. I could maybe say there's a thing called canons, or canonical knowledge. And canons, when I first learned about them years ago, I thought innately that that was BS, and I didn't want to pay attention to it because no two people look exactly alike. So why would I learn? What a canon is it's a rule. So for example, for a lot of people, the width of your eye, right? So from the outer corner to the inner corner, there's one eye right across the middle, right there. And a lot of people fit that. But I've seen people whose eyes feel far apart, and people whose eyes feel close together. So why would I ever learn this false rule? But really, what I'm learning is a ruler. I'm learning a measurement, and I can use that. So if I say the average is to have one eye between, right? Both eyes. When I see someone and I want to sculpt someone that looks like that person, I can say, oh, they don't fit that rule because their eyes are far apart, or they don't fit it because it's close together. So understanding these relationships and being able to look and sort of visually measure using one element to compare it to another element, that's really important. And then angles are the specific measurement, or a specific measurement tool that you can use to get you from point A to point B. So we'll talk about this a lot when I sculpt. And then finally, you want to break your shapes down into, primary shapes. So in the case of something like this little alligator, right? There is one big wedge shape. And if I don't get that big wedge shape right, and I'm trying to get my sculpt to look exactly like this, it's never going to work. If I don't have this exact sort of box, right, where it gets thinner towards the tip of his mouth and thicker towards the middle of his body, I'm never going to get, doesn't matter how well I execute the scales or anything else, this has to be right first. And that requires a certain way of thinking and a certain sort of discipline to not just all of a sudden want to get to the good parts, right? So I try to establish the big shapes first, just like we talked about in hierarchy. Secondary shapes live inside of the primary shapes, right? So I need to get that big wedge shape in first, and then all of the individual shapes that live inside of there, I can start to break those out, and you know, those can be sort of individual shapes that I worry about. And then tertiary shapes, or third shapes, they are the little details that are the most fun to sculpt sometimes, but they end up being the things that you are, if you don't nail the first two levels, this third level, it doesn't matter how nice you execute this third level, it won't ever read like the thing that it's supposed to be, right? And the way that I ensure that at each level things are doing the job that they're supposed to do is I try to create clean forms by thinking about the apex of individual forms. So every form in our body, there's very little sort of straight lines in anything organic. And if I think about my cheek or my forearm or my shoulder or whatever, any of these curves, there's a high point to that curve, and you have to find and control where that high point is. If I think about my forearm here, right, there is a slightly different shape here and a slightly different shape here, and it's because they have two different apex points, two different high points. So every time you think about individual shapes, you want to try to think about where that high point is. And in sculpture, whether you're talking about physical clay or whether you're talking about working in something like ZBrush, like we're going to do today, you really want to pay attention to the highlight, right? The way the light is moving over the surface is going to tell you everything about the shape of that surface, right? So what I want to do is I want to do a live demo for a bit, right? We've got, I think, like 2 hours together. I want to do a live demo for a bit, and then I also want to then go into an older piece that this sort of relates to, right? An old dinosaur piece. And because it's got all these different levels of detail, and sort of break down how I executed that piece as well, right? So let's start though with a live demo. And what I would like to do is maybe get Monique, could you get someone from the audience to volunteer?
Okay, so I from what I understand is they're supposed to are they telling you like character traits to draw?
No. So the thing I'm going to ask
Yeah.
is, do we want a character or a creature? That's
Okay.
going to be the first question.
Character or creature. So if you let us know in the comments, I will mention it to Danny. And
Yep.
what's the follow-up after character or creature?
Male or female?
Okay.
And then the third question is going to be young or old.
So we have I see creature.
Creature. All right.
Okay.
Cool.
So male or female? Oh.
There's a bunch of characters that popped up after that.
Yeah, right? Okay,
Yeah.
y'all gotta be quick, man.
All right. So I tell you what, I'll do a little bit of both.
I see there's a bunch for old.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a bunch for
I'll
old.
do a bunch for old. Oh, shout out to Sheehan. That's
Um,
somebody. That's somebody you should do a demo with for sure.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll introduce you guys after.
Look, there's so much old female creature, old.
All
So
right,
it looks like old female creature.
all right, so cool. So you know what? Let's mix it up. Let's say it's gonna be sort of a old witch, right? Something like that, right?
Okay.
And what I'll do is just so I like to jump between 2D and 3D, and for me, it's not about being some like master illustrator or whatever when I'm doing 2D. What it's about is getting a basic idea down, right? Um, so I'll try to get down, and you know what? Actually, let's do this. I'll keep this to basically a bust because we have limited time, right? So let me delete all of this. So this is Sketchbook Pro. If you haven't used it, it's a free program. It's really great, super intuitive. It's got a mirroring feature here, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an old. Let's do one male and one female, right? So I'll do sort of an old shaman, let's say. And the first thing I want to try to establish is what is the giant graphic shape. So I'll make this guy's shape something sort of like this, right? And what I'll also do is I'll pick a dominant sort of side. So it's not 50-50, sort of like how this is. I'll take one edge and I'll make it longer. And since it's a male, and typically males have big jaws, I'm gonna go ahead and make the bottom part a little bit longer. So let's see if I can do that. And The things that'll make this feel hallmark like an older person are all the bits of delineation, right? So I can sort of say, let's get some eyes in here. And then as soon as I start to add sort of these secondary, tertiary sort of bits, if I give them some old man long earlobes, we're going to start to see that out of that shape comes hopefully something that reads as a little bit older. We can also do things like recede the hairline. And what I typically do with stuff like this is I try to work in a few layers. So you can see the brush that I'm using is very rough. And that's on purpose, right? It's got a lot of variety in the actual shape to it because I don't want to sit here noodling over things this early, right? I don't want to sit here and go, oh, I got to really concentrate and figure out this bit or that bit. I don't want to do that this early. This is a stage where I'm just trying to come up with ideas, right? And if I get an idea that I like, right, so I'd probably do about 7 or 8 of these. And if I get an idea that I like, what I would then do is make another layer and start to refine and maybe use a slightly different brush, right? And and even with this brush, even though it's got a little more fidelity, I'm using a really big brush, right? So you'll notice I'm not like making
Wow.
my brush super small and coming in here and like getting all noodly. I can later if I want to, but that's the part that I really want to save for ZBrush, right? So I can come in here, oops, and make the brush a little bit bigger. So maybe something like that. And also I'm using a Wacom Cintiq. I like Cintiqs and I like any tablet really. If you have not used one of those, it is super helpful. To it's basically just like an iPad, right? But this part, Sketchbook Pro is also available on the iPad. So if you have access to an iPad, that is great. Um, but here, I'll just quickly sort of block out this old dude. And here's where, in 2D, you can really sell that age, right? So uh, if I did this as one big long fluid line like this, it would read. But by breaking up that line, it really sort of says, hey, you know, um, this is a weathered, sort of aged aspect of the character, right? So let's do something like that. And when I'm doing this, sometimes I'll make up stories in my head, especially if you get an assignment. And sometimes you get an assignment and it's really early in the project and they don't even know yet everything about the character. And that's my favorite because then you really get to go story time. So, for example, this might be a character that, you see it all the time in films. You get a character that you think is the good guy or the bad guy or whatever, and then later on you find out something else. So you might look at this character who's maybe stern and find out later on this is the person that was looking out for you the whole time. You know what I mean? So let's say whatever. So let's say this is a quick first pass, right? I'll maybe do one more pass just to. So if I turn this sketch off, I have the line work which maybe looks a little more finished, but it lost a lot of life, right? If I turn that sketch back on, it looks better for whatever reason. It's got more energy in it because the other sketch had some of that stuff. So to eliminate the idea that this is just a line drawing over a sketch, what I'll do is I'll put another layer here. And what I do sometimes there is turn the opacity down, just like I did for the first layer, and I'll put in some shading, right? So let's turn that down a little bit more. And the whole time, I'm only using 1 or 2 brushes and I'm using one value the whole time, right? So I'm just using right now complete black and then I'm using the opacity of the brush to determine sort of which way to go, right? But even this, so a big part of what I've ended up doing for the last 5 or 6 years of my career has been sort of showing people the value of using 3D as a design tool. Because a lot of the people that are in charge at studios right now, When they were in production, a lot of them, 10, 15 years ago, before they became decision makers, 3D was too slow to actually contribute this way. So a lot of them still have the mentality that 3D is something that can't rival 2D in terms of speed, right? Which in a lot of cases is actually still true. But when you're early on in the process, right? So that was a few minutes to come up with one head. Let's now come up with another head. Let's do a female version. And I'll do the same process. I'll start out rough. When you're really early on in a project, the way I try to time box things in my head is with, I always use the idea that if I come into work at 9 o'clock, back when going to work was a thing, if I come into work at 9 o'clock, then I want to have something to talk about before noon, whether that's with a director or another coworker or whatever. I want to have something to discuss before noon that day. That's super important to me. So, what can I get done in a few hours when it comes to this kind of work? When it comes to, you know, uh, you know, just sort of, some people call it ideation, even though I'm not a huge fan of that term. But when I'm just coming up with ideas for a thing, what can I do? So we have the shaman, and now let's say this is sort of the witch, and I want to stay away from the typical iconography of like the big nose witch, right? But like let's say here we use the same technique, right? We age her up a little bit, give her a couple of extra lines. And with a woman, it'll definitely feel, or a feminine character, it'll definitely feel very masculine really quickly if you take too many liberties with adding all those shapes, right? So let's give her a neck, and I'm going to turn off the symmetry momentarily, give her a little bun on one side, and then we can turn the symmetry back on and sort of keep working. So if you're working on a character that is not symmetrical, obviously this won't work. But if you're working on a character that is symmetrical, this is just to eliminate, you know, this is coming up with the idea of the character. It's not necessarily to, you know, um, flesh out the character completely, right? So this character, her sort of shape was something more like this, right? And if I do the same thing really quickly, so let's turn this down and let's go and do the same thing in terms of line art. And you have to be a little more subtle with, female characters and babies. And what I mean is, there's a reason why when you look at a lot of ZBrush sculpture online, you see a lot of monsters and muscle dudes and things like that. And sculpture of all kind, it's way more difficult to, generally speaking, to nail something where all the shapes have to be completely correct. If I'm working on something that has a lot of surface interruption, right? A lot of little lines where things are broken up, I can basically cheat, meaning I can make the thing still look pretty good to the average person if shapes are not completely 100% correct or nailed. With shapes that need to be smoother, right, to be recognizable, typically effeminate shapes or youthful shapes, it's really tough. It's really tough to get those shapes to read appropriately, right? And both of these shapes are probably, just because of the time that we have, um, both of these shapes probably have a fair amount of anatomy in them that we may end up not getting to that level. But this would be sort of the witch, and then we've got the shaman there, and I drew off the edge of the page like I normally do because I can't measure. And so let's say like that, and then finally the shadow layer. Oops, move that down there. And yeah, so Sketchbook Pro is not as robust as Photoshop, in my opinion, but it's a great sketching tool, and I like how responsive it is, right? So I like to sketch in here. I like to paint a little more in Photoshop when I need sort of precision of color and variety of brushes and things like that. Photoshop is, one of the best. But if I'm doing stuff like this where I'm sort of just sketching and creating ideas, I'll use this a lot, right?
So we have
Um,
a comment here.
yes.
It says, I noticed that some artists create muscular guys because they can't do the nuance of softer characters.
That's a better way to say what I was trying to say for sure. Yes, that's exactly it, because you can't hide anything. Like the shapes are either correct or they really appear incorrect right away, right?
Mm.
So, time wise, I'm willing to bet that I spent more time on, her than I did him, right? But when you're all, sort of done, you could do these lineups. If I sat here this way for an hour or two, I would have quite a few, sort of lineups to look at, depending on the assignment, right? If I got the assignment that basically said, hey, you're going to make this shaman, he's an old man, and, blah, blah, blah. And then I show up with, what do you think? They're going to look at me like I'm crazy, right? Like that's not what they asked for. But if it's just, hey, come up with a variety of faces, right? Then okay, cool. This was a good maybe first start. And when I'm all done, I'll sort of take one layer and do that, and then I have merged them all down. I'll take another layer and do that, and then I'll, in a couple of hours, you can get quite a few of these sort of done, and then you'll probably get direction that says, okay, execute on this one or that one, right? So, or sometimes depending on the temperament of the art director you're working with, etc., you might get things like, oh, I like the eyes on A and the mouth on B, and you sort of hodgepodge things together, right? So maybe give her some wild hair just to finish her out. Make it kind of white so we can. She's got some white hair grown out, right? But in any event, you'll get to a point where someone who's making a decision will tell you, yeah, that's the one, go for that. All right, cool. So I just like the shapes in this one better. I'm not trying to cop out on doing the woman, but I like the shapes, the configuration of shapes in this one better. And what I'm going to do is pop open ZBrush. And for people that do use ZBrush, feel free to ask whatever questions. I'm going to keep this because I'm not sure who's watching and how much experience you have. Um, so I'm going to keep this sort of at an introductory level unless people have specific questions, and feel free if you do, and then we can sort of talk about that. But basically, the ZBrush is a great sculpting program. My interface for ZBrush doesn't look like the typical ZBrush interface. This is one that I use because it has all my tools that I normally use right where I want them. I'm right-handed, and I use a Cintiq, which I'm drawing on the screen, right? So I want all of my tools pushed to the right side or to the bottom, because if my tools are set up to the left side of the screen, that means I'm covering the screen with my arm constantly to go get tools, and it means I can't see the thing that I'm working on. So no matter what the tool is, I usually try to push Photoshop or ZBrush, whatever. I try to push all my frequently used tools to the right, so that way I'm going here and I can keep my eyes on what I'm doing and then come back, right? So that's an important thing to me.
That's such a
Uh,
good tip. Like, that makes so much sense.
it's ergonomically, I think, better if you're not reaching across your body like that.
Mhm.
I've been working 23 years and then a few years of school before that, and thankfully so far I haven't had any like repetitive stress or carpal tunnel or whatever. And somebody told me early on, and I do this still to this day. I don't know if it helps, but I haven't had those issues, thankfully. Um, Change your setup every few weeks, right? So if your keyboard, like your keyboard usually has the little legs on it at the bottom. If your keyboard has legs, every once in a while, click them in and leave it that way for a week, and click them out and leave it that way for a week. And by changing the angle of your hands, changing the angle of your Cintiq, changing, I invested in a desk that is height adjustable, right? So if you can change your setup every once in a while, it means you're not constantly reusing the same motion and grinding bones together, etc. A lot of people, I've known a few people who basically have had to leave the industry for a while or permanently because of repetitive stress related disorder. So it's a big deal because you're doing the same thing over and over again. You wouldn't think that you could get injured making art, right? It's not like you're an athlete or anything, but this is
Right.
super important, to just take care of that part, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from just a ball, and I moved this over. I've got a few monitors here, and I've moved this over to a second monitor. If you don't have a second monitor, but you have a phone, you can toss it to your phone. If you have a tablet, you can toss it to your tablet. App, you could print it out. Years and years ago, when I had a single monitor and just a little tablet, what I did at some point was I would actually take tracing paper and trace over something that I drew digitally because I didn't have a printer. And then I would put that off to the side, and that would be my reference. And every once in a while, I'd bring the image up and I'd look at that, and then I'd sort of keep working,
Mm.
right? So, but there's a lot of ways you can do things in a lot of ways. And I think now, and I thought I was like doing something super clever back then, and I was just probably being dumb.
Oh,
So
we have a question.
yes,
Do you have any tips for analyzing existing work to figure out shape language to inform areas that are not described in the drawing?
absolutely. So let's pop back to the drawing even before I start. And I should have done this, so thank you. That question comes right in time.
Okay.
So now I'll just pick a different color here. Let's go like red, right? And I'll say, okay, the primary shape that I was after initially was this, right? So if this dude is a shaman and he's a bad guy or whatever, this is shaped almost like a coffin, right? Or a tombstone or something like that. So you want to get that idea. I didn't execute that idea so well, but maybe it's something I want. Let's assume, just to answer the question more accurately, that no, I like this configuration of shapes later, better, right? There are specific, when we went through those things, it was angle, relationship, cross section, and hierarchy. And I was that kid in school where I wasn't so good at remembering all of the facts, but I could cheat by giving myself an acronym. So I use ARCH, right, as my acronym: angle, relationship, cross section, and hierarchy, right? And actually, if you look at them in terms of importance, it's backwards. Hierarchy is the most important thing, cross section is the next most important thing, relationships is the next most important thing, and angles is the next most important thing. So they go from importance from right to left, but I remember them as arch, right? But angles here, what I can do is I can say, okay, if I go from this corner of the eye to that corner of the eye, and then go down here to the tip of the nose, that makes a very specific kind of triangle. There's all kinds of triangles, right? I can make a, sort of skinny one, a fat one, whatever. But this one here, where I can look and say, okay, well, the angle here, right? If I look at sort of the middle of this here, it's basically a little bit squat, right? So it's not, if I am measuring in my sculpt from corner of the eye to corner of the eye to the tip of the nose, and I get this, I've done something wrong and I need to change some of the sculpt, right? So whenever you're looking at replicating something that exists, I always try to use angles and relationships this way, right? Because they figured out some of the other stuff. It's inherent in the design, but angles and relationships, I always try to use this way. So another one is, I'll say, from the corner of the eye to the corner of the mouth, it's going to make a rectangle like that across. And that rectangle is a very specific rectangle, right? It sort of looks like that. If I have something where my mouth is too wide or my eyes are too close together, I'm going to get an inversion, right? Where the top angle is thinner and the bottom angle is longer, right? And if I see that in my sculpt, something is wrong, right? So I need to make sure that I'm always constantly looking at these relationships and how they work together. And angles, why that's a separate thing is because I'm using these specific angles to make imaginary shapes that give me all of the roadmap to how I want to match this thing, right? Um, so depending on that's more of like a modeling task. What I want to do here is I want to make something that resembles that guy, but I don't want to model exactly that guy because this design is really just sort of a quick, fast thing. I want to advance this design. I want to keep these ideas and I want it to be recognizable. But if there's something in 3D that I come up with, something in the nose or the relationship of the nose to the mouth, if there's something in there that I come up with that is even more appealing or better, I want to go with that, right? So this is still part of the design process for me because there is a time definitely to execute, but now I'm actually using this to design instead of just execute. So I'm just going to start with this ball, and I've got that thing over to the side. You can also with ZBrush, if you want to sort of keep this to the side here, you can use, and there's ways to use this as an image plane inside of ZBrush, which I'm not going to get into, but I can use see-through, and see-through just lets me see through to the desktop. So I can basically put this on the desktop and I can use that as a reference. It takes the whole interface, excuse me, and it makes it see-through unless you hover over a button, right? And then the interface comes back. So that's one thing you can do. I also use PureRef a lot, and PureRef is a separate free program that you can use. And with PureRef, you can have things that sit on top. So, for example, I'm looking tonight is a first class. After this class, I have a first class for a school at the West Coast on the West Coast, and we're doing something related to Spider-Verse. So I have some Spider-Verse stuff here in PureRef. And if I actually take this and let's say zoom into PureRef is great because you can let's say I wanted to see this image, just double click it. It makes it full screen or full resolution for the window that you have, right? Um, and if you double click it again, it goes back. But what's great is there's a mode in here. You can right click and say mode, and you say always on top. And now, even when I click back into ZBrush, I can move ZBrush, but this thing always stays here and always has a ton of good reference, right? So I love using PureRef. PureRef is really great. So sometimes I would just save my drawing out, right, as a PNG or a JPEG or whatever, and then open it up in PureRef, right? Drag and drop it right into PureRef, and then keep my PureRef up on the side right there like that, right? But having it off to the side here is sort of good enough, right? So, okay, let's get down to the sculpting. For these first bits, all I'm going to do is use move and smooth, right? So turn on my mirroring, right? So hit X on the keyboard to turn that on. And I just want to adjust the silhouette and get the silhouette of a head. And what I'm after here is, you can see it's rare that I actually click and drag with the move tool. It's a lot of, at this early stage, just tapping, right? So for me, it's tap, 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 tap. And then if I hold down shift, I'm smoothing.
And are you using the Cintiq for this, like with the Cintiq pen, or are you using like a mouse? A Cintiq also?
Yep, Cintiq also.
Okay.
Yep. And in these early stages, you could get away with using a mouse, right, with the biggest shapes. Later on, when you start getting into sort of finessing smaller shapes, it's going to be a lot tougher because you want the responsiveness of going thick to thin. And that's what the Cintiq really does for you, right? It gives you sort of a thick to thin movement. So at this stage, I'm not really, at least for me, I don't consider this really sculpting. I'm more modeling than anything else. And when we talked about that highlight, right? If we look at the way this geometry is laid out, we've got basically a grid in the front, grid on the top, grid on the sides, and then like a little area between the grids that sort of helps to delineate between the sort of top plane and front plane and side planes. And what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at the way that that highlight breaks across those planes. And I need to get that image that we looked at with that alligator where it had that big wedge shape. I need to get basically the equivalent of that big wedge shape in here, right? So I'm going to start by looking at the drawing, and he's got a really wide chin. So I'm just going to pull that chin down. And I'm also at this stage, what a lot of people do when they're first starting out with ZBrush is they want the model to look really, really smooth in the beginning. And for me, you can see I'm leaving the model chunky. And when I started, the scene that I started with, there's a few scenes here called Dynamesh Sphere. I started with the lowest one, 32. And the reason I started with that is because the chunkiness here, all the little areas where I can see the highlight changing, give me information that I can go off of, right? So his jaw right now is pitched forward quite a bit. I'm not sure if I like that or not. I won't really change it that much yet, but I will just sort of keep that there. But or sorry, his chin, I should say. But his jaw, I'm going to go ahead and pull that back like that and help keep that sort of masculine sort of profile. And now, let's say I'm happy with this as like a general silhouette for my head. What One of the best pieces of advice that I got, and I didn't get it until I was 10 years in, was put down your pen, right? And what they meant was, just to illustrate that here in 2D really quickly, what the person that told me that meant was, there's a reason why you'll see people that are drawing, right? There's a reason why when you're drawing ahead, you see this kind of thing a lot, right? What is this doing? This is giving me an angle, right? That middle line shows me where the nose is. This line shows me where the eye line is. That line shows me where the mouth is. All right, cool. I've done that for years. But put down the pen after you do that and look at it and go, is that really the angle that I want the head to be looking at? And if it's not, fix it. If I really want the head to be tilted slightly, all right, fix it. If I want the head to be tilted up, tilted down, fix it. So that's why you work in these stages. It's to check, to measure, because by default, everybody wants to go in and just start working on an eye and then work their way out from the eye, right? Um, that's the way a child usually approaches it. When you learn a more structured approach like this, well, why is that there? It's there for you to be able to stop and take a look and measure and check and make sure you like it, right? So here, as I'm working on this dude, like I said, I don't know about that jaw. It's in my mind as something I might potentially sort of pull back to change a little bit. But before I start adding sort of next level stuff, right? So like, where are the ears? The ears for us, they connect. If you follow your jawline, right, they go up, and then that's about where your ear is, right, the edge of your jaw. So before I go adding something for the ears, let's really look at this jaw and how it sort of fits with everything else, because I know the placement of the ear is going to hinge off of that. Um, Another way people try to give themselves a little sort of insurance is by using separate objects. So what I'll do, ZBrush is great. You have subtools where you can have different models all in the same scene, all in their own, almost like a layer, right? Like in Photoshop. But what's great is each subtool has its own undo cue. So up here at the top, I can drag this undo all the way back to when this was just a ball, or
Wow.
go all the way forward to this cube. And if I duplicate this subtool, I now have that cube shape. But if I want to make a new shape, you can see this guy's undo is only one step. But if I go to this subtool, his undo cue lets me go all the way back to when I was a ball. And now I can take that and say, hey, let's make some eyeballs, right? So I can drag that, scale it, sort of move it into place. And it's one of the weird, quirky things about ZBrush that I think is sort of fantastic. I don't know of another program that lets you do that. Um, so let's say I take his eyeballs. I'm gonna make them a little bigger than I think they need to be. And I'm just gonna mirror them. There's a little thing up here that lets me mirror them quickly. Oops. So I'll just do that. I can mirror it in other ways, but this way just sort of does it in one step like that. And now I can move the eyeballs and it'll even mirror the movement, right? Where I can move them closer together, further apart, whatever. And the important thing here by having this sort of sphere in here is I can sculpt around it, right? So I'll do that and just sort of give them a place. And if I look, this dude is not sort of how he's more stylized, pushed proportionally. Like, so for us, right, we get fooled by our hairlines. Your eyes are at the center of your head usually. So the space from here to here is usually about the same as the space from here to here, right? So for most people, that's usually true. That's one of those canons again, right? So the eye line is actually center of the face. If we look at him, he definitely has more real estate at the bottom than he does at the top. But we stated that we were going to do that in the beginning, right? That we were going to exaggerate his sort of pushed down jaw. So now I can take this and let's start blocking in some landmarks like the, oops, sorry, let's go here to the right subtool. Also, having separate subtools, it protects one model while I work on the other model. So I can start to put in an indication of some eye sockets. And the eye sockets have to be the right shape and the right size first before I can think about lids, right? That's one of those things that where it's like getting the hierarchy right is super important. So now we could start to pull out a section for the nose, and we could start to pull out a section for the muzzle for the mouth. And I can see already I'm running out of real estate here down at the bottom, much like I did in the drawing. And I can start to pull this down. And because I started this as a Dynamesh model, Dynamesh is a mode that basically, the more you pull these faces apart, the less detail you can put in them, because only where two edges meet, you have a little point there to move, right? So what I can do is re-Dynamesh, and it redistributes all the points, right? So depending on, there's a number here, right? And my number is set to 32. And that basically means there's a grid with 32 divisions in each direction, and that grid is slamming into this model. If I take that number and turn it up, and I re-Dynamesh, you're going to see it gets really, really dense, which again looks a little better because you can smooth things out, but it's really slow to work with, right? So you have to find the right balance. So this early on for me, something low like 32, or maybe I'll bump this up to 64. So let's say 64 and Dynamesh, and it's still chunky enough that I get a lot of information from looking at the, the way the shapes transition, but I can get something that looks a little bit more smooth maybe. So all of that was using the move brush and the smooth brush, and now I'm starting to get into where I'm at least ready to block in for the face, not really for the head, but for the face, maybe a couple of secondary things. So there's a couple of brushes I like to use. One is Damien Standard. And by the way, this stuff is not unique to me. A lot of people that use ZBrush use the same 5 or 6 brushes. The brushes that ZBrush has in it, that's the mess of brushes that come with ZBrush, right? So it looks insane. And some of these brushes have little sub brushes inside of them, so it looks crazy. But really, the Move brush, Damien Standard brush, and this clay buildup brush, those are the 3 brushes, and the smooth when I hold down shift. Those are the 3 brushes that I'm going to try and navigate through the most, right? So clay buildup just lets me put on blobs of clay like this, right? So I can start to, if I hold down Alt, it does the opposite of what the brush wants to do by default. So this clay buildup brush builds up, right? So I'm looking at his brows, and I can build up. So it's like adding little balls of clay, and then I can smooth it holding shift. And if I want to push in, I can hold Alt, and this is like gouging out clay with your fingers or with a small tool, right? So now we're almost an hour in. So let's speed this up a little bit. So now I'm gonna take this. There's also a way for me to add resolution to this model, which I'll actually use right now, and that's called subdivision. So I'm just gonna subdivide it, and now I'm gonna start to block in some things like the lips. Every time you subdivide it, the model becomes 4 times as dense. Um, and we can get more into that if people have it as a specific question, but I'll sort of leave it like that for now. But now I can start to sculpt on this thing. And what I'm going to do is sculpt in all of my landmarks. Even when I used to work in clay, this was the way that I would try to do stuff. I'd get the basic silhouette in, and then I'd start to carve out in 2 dimensions the way that I want this thing to look and just see if it is reading appropriately, right? And all the shapes don't have to be there, and I can still mush things around. So like the lips right now are really flat, right? Next good big piece of sculptural advice, look from above and below. Not enough people take advantage of this. It will tell you everything about your model. If I look at this from the front, the lips look fine. Even if I look from the side, I would think the lips look fine. But when I look from the top and the bottom, it's going to tell me everything I need to know about the shape of the lips. And those lips now, that cylinder, that muzzle. So for us, make sure your hands are clean, right? Because the times we're living in. But if you go to the corner of your mouth here and you go to the front of your lip here, and then you slide back and you look at that distance, it's way more than you think that it is. And that's because we have that curve there, right? Same thing here with the outside corner of your eye and the inside corner of your eye. If you put your hand near each section and then just slide back and look at the distance, it's way more distance than you actually think that there is, right? So looking from above and below is going to give us the best sort of indication of whether or not things are turning in space enough. And it can make a huge difference in sort of the quality of a model at the end, right? So let's do that. And let's look at his nostrils seem really sort of pitched up in the drawing. So I'm going to do that. And now I'll start to address these lids. So I'm going to take these eyes and maybe shrink them a little bit and move them apart a little bit. And there's a couple of ways to do it. The way that I'll do it is I'm actually just going to duplicate these eyeballs and I'm going to scale them up a little bit. And then I'm going to, there's a brush that'll let me cut them, right? So I'm going to go here and choose that clip curve brush, and I'll just sort of cut it in half almost, right? Like that. And now what I'll get is something that looks like that I can sort of rotate and scale. Oops, I don't want to do that. So let's sort of rotate this a little bit and move it into place. And it's just going to be a really rough approximation. And I'll duplicate that tool. And now that's going to give me my bottom lids. And this is really going to help me tremendously with the placement of things, right? So, for example, this eye, it could be really high or really low, right? This is going to indicate to me, if I look at the profile, how much of the lid from the top and bottom is actually visible and how far I need to dig out the middle part here of where the nose meets, because we do want to see the inside corner of that eye, right? So just having those little spheres there, or hemispheres, sort of tells me quite a bit, right? So I can sort of dig that back a little bit, maybe these spheres, and take the whole eyeball. So I'm going to take the head and mask it, and then I'm going to go to the eyeballs, and I'm going to move them, but I'm going to click on those little boxes, and that moves the eyelids too. And now when I move them forward, move them out a bit, we can start to see where those two shapes come in. So now if I move this, and I'm intentionally speeding up just so we have time to get to the other stuff, but
We do have a question.
yes,
Are there any exercises you suggest for those analytical artists that are perfectionists and immediately go to details so that we can constantly focus on form first?
absolutely. If you're matching something, right, you can blur the image, and that will immediately remove detail. If you give yourself a limit, like I can't, I'm only going to work on Dynamesh 32, let's say, and I'm going to get what I can get with that, right? So you're limited by the actual number of polygons that you have. But most importantly, I think so. Those slides that we looked at, they all come from Anatomy for Sculptors, right? Which is a resource a lot of people use. They have books, they have videos, they have a YouTube channel, they have an ArtStation page, um, and you can look at the breakdowns that they have, right, of individual forms in the body. And what you can do is you can say, okay, well, today I'm only going to work on the first form that they show, because they do a lot of where they show you the rough thing and then the more detailed thing afterwards, right? So you can say, hey, today I'm only going to get the roughest version of that form. And then tomorrow I'll treat myself, look at that again with fresh eyes. And if I need to adjust it, I'll adjust it. But if I don't, then I'll move to the second stage and the third stage. And if you save each stage, thinking about marketing yourself and, just the way sort of social media works, posting each stage and then showing the finish too, now you've worked your way towards something that you can showcase and, sort of uh, people won't know that you struggled with that issue, right? They'll just go, oh, look, this guy really knows what he's doing. So now, let's find a good Dynamesh. The other thing that Dynamesh will do for you is it will allow you to merge pieces together, right? So I just merged together those eyelids, and now we can see that I'm getting, you know, a shape sort of like that, right? Now at this stage, for me, I like to introduce color, right? I've got enough in here where I'm starting to um, get some very basic sort of um, ideas down, some very basic shapes. So I'm just going to say fill object. Let's choose that as our base color. And then I'll go to the eyeballs. And I won't choose white. I'll just choose something in a lighter field of the same color, sort of a painter's principle, right? That painters rarely use white for the eyelids. I mean, for the eyeballs. And I'm going to divide this a few times. And what I'm going to do is paint into even the eyeball. And all of these things, it's temporary. It's not something that would survive to a game or to a film or something like that. But it's something to give me a good indication, right? So I can take this brush and I can turn off its ability to add volume, right? So if I do that by default, it adds volume. If I turn that off and just turn on RGB, it lets me paint, right? So I can paint in just a value. Let me go back and look at my image. Yeah, so he has pretty big eyeballs in the image. And you can just quickly, the shorthand I'll always use, because we get a little shadow from our upper lid, right? The shorthand I'll always use is just make a little U shape in there. And then to fake a little bit of depth, I'll make that a little bit lighter. And what I'll do is you can also apply different materials here, right? So if I choose different materials, we can see we get different looks. One of the materials that I like to use is this eye reflection material, Zebro eye reflection it's called. And I'm going to set this to material instead of RGB, and I'm just going to say flood. And it's going to fill that object, those eyeballs, with that material. So now they look a little bit wet and shiny, right? And it's just a quick sort of shorthand. So now with that, I might actually even do one more thing. I might color the lip a little bit. And what I'll do first is I'll choose a color that is too gaudy. It's not the right color. Oops, sorry. Let's do that. Put you back to RGB. I'll choose a color that's not the right color, right? It looks like he's wearing lipstick. And what I'll do is if I hold C, I can sample a color here, and I sample the skin and then turn the opacity down, and now I can start to sort of get those to relate a little bit better. And now what I'll do is I'll actually sculpt with this turned on, and actually I'll maybe give him brows too, now that I think about it. So let's go back. And eventually I'm going to do things with the brows, like put geometry in here, right? And for the hair, eventually put geometry in here. But for now, I'll put this brow shape in here, because as I'm working and I go to move things, the brow is going to come along for free. So I'm just going to mask off the eyeball so I don't mess it up. And what I can do is, if I decide I want to give him a different expression, the brows go along for free because the paint goes along for free, right? So I can sort of choose what I want, right? And masking is a huge thing. So here, if I mask off the lower lid and I want to increase the thickness of the upper lid, sort of a tip for a lot of animated things. Uh, Usually in animation, what you get is um, for us, for humans, that little wall, that little sort of pink slimy part, right where your eyeball meets your eyelid, that little shelf is pretty consistent all the way around in terms of its thickness. One of the things that happens in animation a lot is they will actually take the middle and make that a little bit thicker than the corners, right? So I'll just invert this mask and do the same thing down here. And because the top is masked off and I just did that, now I get to keep each side of it, right? And now I can sort of go in and really start to drive home some of these shapes, right? So I'll use clay buildup. And sorry, one more thing. When I go to smooth, right? When I smooth, if I do that, right, you'll notice that it's also smoothing out that pink line. If I, let's just put a line here, right? And if I go to smooth, that goes away, right? If I hold down shift, which is my smooth button, and I turn off Z add, now it'll only smooth the color. Or if I keep Z add on and turn off RGB, it only smooths the model and it doesn't smooth the actual color itself. So I'm gonna smooth with that off, because if I smooth things like this eyebrow ridge, I wanna keep the eyebrow intact pretty much, right? Uh, you can also, so let's sort of refine his lips a bit. And once that thing we said earlier about having a form and then having that form have one apex. So here, this whole shape here, right, is going to be one solid form. And what I'm going to do with that form, the way I'm thinking about it, is that there's a whole form there. And the apex of that form is going to be about there. And later on, when I get into the cheek here, this part of the cheek is going to be one big form, and the apex is going to be about there. And this part of the cheek is going to be another separate form with the apex in there, right, as the highest point. So each section of the model, right, is basically going to be broken down in my head into these individual parts. So this is a separate form here, this box, than the rest of the, the nose, because it's basically going to have a separate high point from everything else. And that's how I know to break it off into its own. It's basically putting things mentally into a section and then trying to figure out how that section is going to work, right? So let me just undo that part. And, I know sort of those are the shapes that I'm after. And if I mask again, right, so I can sort of do that. And then let's pull that forward. And you can work with the mask active. If you hit Control H on the keyboard, the mask is still active, but so I can't actually still sculpt in that area, but I just can't see it. So I'll do that a lot, right? And a lot of times I'll invert a mask, right? So I'll come in here and say, let's do that. And then I want to get to the chin here. So let's add volume in the chin. And then let's age them up, right? So those eye bags in here. So I can use a mask that way too. And I'm consciously, as sort of a design, because what is design, right? Design is just how you arrange elements, right? So there's a cheek shape here, and I'm going to break that out into a separate shape because it has a separate apex, and that's going to be his eye bag here. And in the eye bag, I could use the move tool, I could use clay buildup, I could use any of these to sort of say, let's put that shape in there. I'm going to hit Control H to hide the mask. And immediately he gets a little more aged up, right? If I want to put sort of crow's feet in here, what happens sometimes is people tend to think of forms as you just carve the surface in. The way our bodies work, so there are areas like our ears our noses, where we can have natural concave shapes, natural shapes that go in. But usually when we have a concavity in the body, it's because two convex shapes are coming together and pushing against each other. So if you think about the bottom of your finger, where it goes the crease and then the little pads between, that's basically what I'm talking about, right? So we want to control all of our shapes down to the most minute part, right? So um, I'm doing on time. Okay, 409. So let's give this guy some brow wrinkles, some more sort of secondary wrinkles down here. Just age them up a bit. And here's where I can use a mask again. So I'll use a mask on the lip there, and I'll invert the mask. So I do this a lot. Because masking off the entire head would be time consuming, I mask off the area that I actually want to get to and then just invert the mask because it's less time consuming, right? And then now I can sort of take that top lip and sort of really work on how it interacts with the bottom lip. So we get like a nice crease in there, and I can invert that and now work on the bottom lip. And if I know I want to get back to a selection over and over again, there's a thing in here called polygroups. See how the eyelids are a separate color? That means because they came from two separate models, I can isolate those colors by themselves. But you can make your own versions of those. So if I always wanted to get back to these lips exactly, I can make that a color. And now if I ever need to get to just the lips, I can do that, right? If I ever need to get to just the eyes, I can do that. And I'll maybe do, older people tend to, and just as a design thing, we want to make his eyes a center of focus. So I'm just gonna make that a little bit darker, like that. Right, and then now we can start to sort of round out the rest of the head. So let's, this part here, the beauty of this is, let's say I wasn't sure about that chin being so far forward. If I duplicate this, I can come over here to the duplicate, move that chin back, make sure the lips are still curving the way that they should. I could try a different expression. Right, whatever. And then now if I turn off the little visibility icon for those two subtools, I can go up arrow, down arrow, up arrow, down arrow, and I can see, the thing change, right? So I'll do this a lot if I'm working on a head to get a different expression or whatever.
I have a question now.
Yes.
When you duplicated the head, is the original just like inside it? Like, is it just plopped right on top, or is it on another layer that you just
Uh,
turned off?
Yep, it's basically on another subtool, and the
Okay.
visibility for both of them is turned off. So if I turn both visibilities on, you'd see them both at the same time poking through each other. But because both visibilities are off, by default in ZBrush, you're actually taking advantage of I don't know if it's a bug or what in ZBrush, but it's like the way ZBrush works. So the visibility for both of those subtools is off, and if I choose the eyeballs, they both go away.
Oh.
But if I'm on a tool and I turn the visibility off, it doesn't disappear. The active subtool is always visible. So once I turn this one off, all I'm doing with the arrow keys is saying you're active, no, you're active. You're active, no, you're active. And the active one always appears, right? So you could do a whole series of these where you wanted to sort of test the expression really quickly. It's not as good, obviously, as having a real rig in your model, but if you wanted to then turn off the mask, see what he looks like at the end of the movie, right? You can go, oh, there's too much information in here, I need to sort of clean it up. So you can sort of come up with information that's going to help you determine how to use the various forms that you have in the sculpt, right? And in the end, it's all totally non-destructible because it's digital, right? So here with the eyeballs, if I take those, I'm just going to duplicate them and I'm going to move them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that material that's assigned to them. So I'll do that like this. Um, Why can't I select you? I don't know, I'm doing something wrong. But eventually, what I will do is, oh, there we go. So let's go fill object and fill object. So now what I can do is, again, just because there's two of them, right? I can take them and I can move them back here and I can start to build ears. So let's center that, scale it up, rotate it. And again, just like everything else, right? With the ears, an ear is usually a pretty complex form. It's got a lot of little sub forms inside of it. But what I can do is, if I get the big shape right first, right? So how far forward do I want to pitch the ears, right? So do I want them sort of facing the camera, like really far forward? Or do I want them a little more sort of aligned with the head, right? Because different people have them in different configurations, right? So let's say I want something like that to start with. All right, that big shape is there. That's that wedge shape on the alligator again, right? So the big shape is in place. And now I can start to do the general sort of shaping for the ear. So I think for our guy, we gave him really long earlobes. And we have a bone here, right? Our cheekbone that goes back to our ear, and it's the zygomatic arch. So I'm gonna put in an indication of that bone here, and then push the temple in a little bit. And also right where the zygomatic arch is about to meet the ear, right before your ear, you have a little dip in, a sharp dip. So I'm gonna put that dip in there. And then for the ear, I can maybe divide it a little bit. And I can start to, again, same as I did with the face, I can score it, right? So put in a little indication with Damien Standard. You can make it as anatomical as you want. Ideally, what you want, there's a design principle, the smaller is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. And what that means is your decision making should be the same at every level. So if you have this much anatomy in the face, then you shouldn't have an ear that lacks anatomy. You shouldn't have an ear that looks 100% anatomical, because this doesn't look 100% anatomical, right? The big shapes have, sort of a pushed feeling to them. You want to do the same thing with the ear, where it has a push feeling, but it's got enough anatomy to be recognizable instantly as an ear.
Okay, we have an incoming question.
Go for it.
Do you have a mentorship or plan to do one in the future? P.S. Big fan of your work, Danny.
Thank you. I don't have anything like that. I am teaching right now online at a school called Studio Arts. It's based in LA, but now everything is, um, you know, everything is virtual, right? So it doesn't matter where you are in the world. I wouldn't be opposed to it. Drop me a DM on Instagram. My Instagram is just Point Pusher. Same thing for ArtStation. Facebook, I try to stay off of Facebook um,
Understandable.
because it's a mess.
Yeah.
But you know, occasionally I check Facebook too. Um, but it's in all of them. If you look for Point Pusher, you'll find me.
So the
And
best place to contact you essentially is like your Instagram or ArtStation.
yeah, pretty much,
Okay.
yeah. And Instagram only because the convenience of my phone will show me when I have a message, right? So, uh, and I'm old, so I'll play solitaire on my phone a lot because I'm old, and then I'll find that. So let's do that. So I'm just sort of rounding out the rest of these shapes, and see how we doing on time. All right. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to pause this guy, and then we're going to move on to the second half of the demo, where I take an older model that I knew whatever I did with this first part was going to be a little bit more on the stylized side. And while there's a little stylization in the second part, it's got a lot more sort of detail, right? Um, so let's go ahead and put in some hair for this guy. So I'm going to go ahead and just mask off a section here. And actually, I'll color pick right from the eyebrow, fill that, and then maybe he's going to have some grays too. Oops. So we could do sort of, hair that is, flat down to the surface like this, or we could sculpt hair in here, and for a concept sculpt, usually this kind of thing is fine. Um, you can also, there's a cool system in here called fiber mesh. And if you go over to fiber mesh, and this is something where, again, that design principle, the smaller is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. This guy is very stylized, right? So we wouldn't necessarily want to, have something that looks 100% real. But what I can do is I can go to fiber mesh and I can say Lightbox fibers, and then I can choose from a bunch of presets. There's a hair set here called short wavy, and I'm gonna go ahead and click that. Oops, and you can see he just became a werewolf, right? So it's doing it only where it's masked. So I'm gonna do that again. Let's go Lightbox fibers, short wavy, hide, and now it'll put the hair there. But you can modify the hair, right? So I can say, go to the modifiers, and I could say, you know what? I want to stylize it in the same way. This character is chunky, so I want to turn down the maximum number of fibers, and I want to make them chunkier, right? So I can say, let's look at the coverage, and that's how much each hair takes up. And then I could say, okay, do I want it to be longer or shorter? And I won't worry about it poking through things like the ear because I can fix that afterwards. But I can do stuff like that. I can say, let's change the scale at the root and the scale at the tip. So maybe let's make the tips a little bit sort of bigger. And turn that down. And we got to find a balance for these numbers. Whenever we're sort of happy with it, what we can do, turn down that revolve rate like that. So let's say I want something like that to start with, right? I'll hit accept. And it's going to say, hey, would you like to activate fast preview? You can choose to say yes or no depending on the settings for your computer. I'll say yes for now, and I'll get something that looks roughly like that. And when I go to render later on, it's going to give me something that looks like it has a lot more fidelity than I want, right? Like that. And it looks a little chunkier. The model looks a little bit chunkier. You can paint into these. You can sculpt into them. So if I go over here to the subtool, the hair is its own subtool now, and I can actually take this and I can actually sculpt the hair. And when you go to render, you can actually render the hair separate, right? So you can sort of choose sort of how you wanna do it. So you could use sculptable hair. If you want to spend a little more time on it, you could use things like fiber mesh. So it's really sort of up to you how you wanna use this thing, right? Now, if we get to a point where you want to start really refining this, there's one last thing that you could do, and then we'll move into the other parts. So I'm going to merge the ears down so that they're in the same subtool as the head. And then I'm going to dynamesh everything together. And I'll do it at a really high resolution so I don't lose any detail. So now everything's dynameshed together, and you can see it's a lot of little points. So that's going to be really hard to make changes to. What I can do is I can duplicate this subtool, and now I can take this and go down here to geometry, and I can say Z-remesh. So I'm going to turn Dynamesh off, and I'm going to say Z-remesh. And Z-remesher is going to give me a low resolution model where we're going to lose a lot of detail, we're going to lose a lot of the painting, but it's going to be so low res and generally follow these shapes that I can work with it a lot better, right? So we get the flexibility of being able to sculpt with this easier, but the actual information that we already put in there is like, so this you can see looks much more like what you would see as a sort of almost animation suitable mesh. You still need to, for real production, do real topology for things that are going to require specific rigs and animation, right? Z-remesh is great for like props, or if you have, sort of simple things um, that don't require complex animation, you can use Z-remesher for a lot of stuff, especially for games, right? But for film, you typically, if this is a character, I'm going to need to really make sure the topology of this character is suitable for animation, right? So Z-remesher is not going to give me everything that I need. So I made these changes, but I lost a lot of work. So what I can do though is now this model, I can use subdivisions, right? So I can say divide, divide, and every time I do that, this number up here is going to change, this active points. So it's taking each face and it's cutting it into fours. So every
Mm.
time I divide, it's basically giving me 4 times as many polygons. So now I've got 3 million polygons, which means I can come in here and I can sculpt really fine detail, right? And I can get really sort of noodly about each detail. And again, when I'm sculpting, when if I pay attention to the way I think about shape, um, it's not enough to carve in these shapes, right? You then have to go into each shape and try to give each little shape an apex, give each shape a volume, and it's going to elevate the sculpture, you know, tremendously if you can do that, right? So, because it's again things crashing into each other that make those concavities. It's not just a line dug in, right? So, so I've got a lot more detail now. But I can also go down here and go down the subdivision chain, and now I can make big changes, right? So if I wanted to change the nose, if I wanted to change, sort of the mouth, the expression, I can make big changes, right? So he just became Robert De Niro super fast, right? So now if I go back to before I did those, what I can also do is I can take all the detail that I had previously and I can project it onto this model. So this is normally the chain that I go through for a workflow. I'll start out with Dynamesh, establish some shapes. Once I get the shapes that I like, I'll then duplicate the mesh and I'll create a more structured mesh using Z-remesher. And what I'll do is right here, if I go to project, I can say project all. And the only things that are visible right now are my new mesh and my original mesh. So I'm going to say project all. It's going to say, would you like poly paint? I'm going to say yes. And it's going to project the poly paint down onto the model. If there are areas in my mesh where I've moved them and they're too far away, I can sort of smooth them or move them back into place a little bit. And then reproject. And they'll get cleaned up. So I can see I moved. I remember when I first Z-remeshed it, I moved those points, right? So you can sort of keep whittling down, or you could just fix it in the new model or undo the new model back to before you did that, and everything should project properly, right? So now if I turn off the eyeball here, oops, let's build these up a little bit and then project all again. And this will be the last one. And if I need to clean it up by hand, I'll clean it up by hand. Yes, I'll just clean that part up by hand. But now what I can do is I can work with the detail that I had and clean this up a little bit, but I'm working with something that also has a structured sort of, more standard configuration of edges. Before I do this, if I go back here, actually let's go back to this one. I'm going to duplicate it again and do that process again. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something that looks like it breaks the model a little bit. What I can do is, let's say I want specific edges here in the forehead. I'll actually carve those edges in. Even though I know I don't really want them, I'll carve them in, or I'll carve in some wrinkles for his eyes. Because what Z-Remesher does is it looks at the actual model itself, the curvature of the model. And then based on the difference in curvature, it'll try to put an edge loop there. So if I do something like that, and if I want an explicit edge loop around the bottom of the nose, like that. Now when I go to Z-Remesh it, if I go Geometry, Z-Remesher, it's going to take a moment, and when it's done, I should get edge loops that try to follow some of these shapes, because I carved into the surface deeply, and I should be able to project most of the detail that I had previously back onto this mesh. So now we can see we have edge loops that follow those shapes, right? So what that means is when I go to divide this model, so divide, 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 there's more edges packed into those areas because each face gets subdivided 4 times, right? So if there's a lot of little edges in one spot, they each get subdivided more. So I literally have more detail in there, which is going to help me later on. When I go to add detail, this area will always stay a little more sharp, right? But if I go here, show this original tool, project all, yes, give me the poly paint. Right, there's a couple little areas where I added those creases where they don't line up, so I have to clean that up. But again, it's pretty easy to go in here and clean those areas up. And now I have sort of a best of both worlds scenario where I can go down in resolution or up in resolution. And going down in the resolution is great because I can make broad changes really easily, right? And it's fast and it's responsive. And again, this is not suitable for real animation, right? But if you're making a statue of someone, if you're making a printable figure, if you're making a prop that doesn't need to get animated, this is great. So let's go into, if anybody has any questions, shoot them out, and then I'll load up my other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about.
Well, I will just say that was extremely informative.
Cool.
Even like as I don't have a modeling or sculpting background or anything, but just understanding the relation between like anatomy and breaking things down by shapes, even as when you're illustrating, you try to do the same thing in character design ultimately. So also it's really amazing how you're able to like destruct and reconstruct stuff so easily. And the history that you can just scroll and go back to so many points. And
Yeah.
it's not like you have a cutoff, like you can only like backstep like 3 times or something. That's really,
Yeah.
really amazing. And you make ZBrush look less intimidating than it seems to be. Or maybe not. Maybe I spoke too soon because now there's a picture.
No, so the thing is, each one of those undos, each one of those subtools, they each can have each subtool can have 10,000 undos.
Wow.
So I don't know how they do that. I don't know how that works, but also ZBrush, like at this point, if I tried to open up a model that was this dense in Maya, so if I look at the total number of points here, for the entire scene, there's 15 million points in here. And I can't open 1 million in Maya. Maya will chug and crash, and I couldn't do it, right? But Maya's not, to be fair, Maya's not made for that. Maya's made
Right.
to move things around interactively, right? So that part is great. But one of the things that you have to do, the same kind of hardware limitation you have in Maya, you have in video game consoles, where you need to move things around interactively. And one of the things that you're going to have to do is create textures, right? Create maps. And what you're going to do is, if you're not familiar with this concept, if you imagine a map of the world flat, if you wrap that map of the world around a basketball, you're going to see, essentially a globe, right? Same information, but wrapped differently, right? So a UV texture is basically just when you take that information and you unwrap it into a flat state. So this model already has that done on it, right? And there's tons of information out there about how to do it. This model utilizes subdivisions, right? So if I go down to the lowest subdivision level, and I'm going to isolate the model by itself without the extra bits, the eyeballs and the plaque and all that stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go to UV map, and I'm going to hit this morph UV button. And this is just going to show me what the UV texture for this model looks like flattened out, right? So
Wow.
that's the flattened out version of the UV texture for this model, right? So the UVs for this are not ideal. There's an automatic UVing algorithm um, in ZBrush, and this is from an older demonstration that I did for a class where we sculpted this over the course of a couple of classes, and then we were like, okay, cool. We want to make now a concept sculpt that we drop into Substance Painter, and then we eventually end up in Marmoset Toolbag. Marmoset Toolbag is great. It's a really fun, quick, and dirty way to take a look at models. Where's my window? There you go. Sorry. So we go over here to Marmoset and just launch this. And I'll show you what the final one looks like. And for the remaining time, we'll talk about the steps to go from here to there. So this is what the final one looks like in Marmoset, right? So I can rotate around this, and we can see that it looks like it has the illusion of having a lot of detail. If we look at the actual model itself, so if I make a new material and I just drag that material on top of here, you can see all those scales and all that stuff. None of that stuff is there. If I turn this down so we can see it a little easier, none of that stuff is there. And if we go look at the where are you? I can't read. All right, I don't remember where it is, but you can turn on the wireframe for this thing. I don't remember where the wireframe is. Um, but in any event, if I select it, we can see the wireframe like that, right? So you can sort of see there's not enough detail in there for all of those little
Mm-hmm.
pores and stuff, right? But we baked out a normal map, and I'll talk about the process of doing that in a second. But if we go over here, I can say, show me the normal map, right? And you can see that it adds so much more detail, right? And it's basically a way to, let me go back to my 2D side. And again, for the folks that are already well versed in this part, I apologize, but I'll be brief, right? So if you have a model, whatever that model is, and you break it out into UVs, the UVs are flattened out as a texture. And if the high res version of this model has a lot of detail in it, right? So let's say that's the eye, and it's got a lot of little detail in it. If the eye lives here in the UV texture, right? That's where the eye sits. You're taking all of the detail here in the high res model, and you're comparing it to the low res model where there's no detail, but there's good UVs. And you're saying take all this detail, and every place you see a lump or a bump, put it in the texture, right? And then that texture is what tricks the lighting into looking like you have more information than you need. And for video games, that's essentially the trick, because you don't have enough. The hardware for a video game is not robust enough yet to show you the raw model. But even that is changing. It's changing all the time. If you're really nerdy and you've seen the Unreal Engine 5 demo, you know what I'm talking about. But that stuff is changing a lot. So what I'm able to do is use that texture in conjunction with color information to create the model. So what I did was I originally had a Dynamesh model, right? Same process that we just talked about. So I had a Dynamesh model that was just from a ball that had all this information on it. The one thing we didn't talk about too much, so I'm going to duplicate this mesh, go down here. And this is where I say so let's just actually smooth this out a bit. So we have no indication of detail on here whatsoever. But we still have good UVs on here, right? So now what I'm going to do is add detail to here, and you'll see how quick it is to add the detail once you have good information on here, right? So I'm going to go and delete my higher levels, and I'm just going to divide this a bunch. So the first thing that we'll notice, if I go back to here and we zoom in on this little alligator guy, and let me load up my other PureRef.
Okay, we do have a couple questions.
Go
Do you
for it.
want to? Okay. First question. How early on in the process, when working on a character, do you communicate with riggers and character TDs?
It depends on how much is unknown about the character. If it's a pretty standard character, right? So like, and it depends on the pipeline too. So at Blue Sky, they did a lot of unique rigs for a lot of characters, right? At DreamWorks, they do less unique. They do unique rigs, but the characters share topology a lot, right? So the riggers can say, okay, well, these edges, we've rigged the character, and these edges make up the shoulder, these edges make up the elbow, these edges make up the fingers, and they have tools that'll go through and propagate tools all the way through. I believe Blue Sky probably works that way now too. When I was there years ago, it was a lot of sort of individual rig components, right? So the amount that you have to communicate with the rigger depends a lot on technology. In games, the few times I've worked in games, it was typically the case that you would already have a rig and you would make a model, and then there were tools to automatically fit that rig to the model, and you don't have to communicate with the rigger almost at all, right? So the rigger is the one who set up the or they're rarely called riggers there. It's like a technical character artist, but they normally set up the framework that lets you do that, right? So you can apply it right to your model, and you can see your model running around. We would export out low res models from ZBrush, and you could see the silhouette of your character running around in the game in the same afternoon that you sculpted it. And then you could have confidence that based on where that thing was going to be in the world, the shapes were working appropriately in the proper context. And if that was right, then you could go ahead and add more detail later on, right? So really, it depends. Ideally, early. Ideally, you'd work with a rigger as early as possible, but you should have flexibility. In those game situations, if I went to go talk to some of the riggers right away as I'm working on something, they'd look at me like, dude, don't bother me. Like, go do your job, go get the model done, and then like we'll talk later, right? If you have trouble fitting the rig to the model, then let's talk. But in situations like at Blue Sky, so I'll give you an example, right? Something we used to do at Blue Sky, you would get a piece of concept art, and I don't know if it's still like that. Andre could speak to this more. But we would get a piece of concept art, and the concept art would have the character in a pose, right? We would show the model and try to get approval on the model roughly in that pose. Before it went to animation, rigging and modeling had to work together to make a neutral model that they could put a rig in to get back to that exact pose.
Mm.
And then that was when you could do that without too much jumping through hoops, because you have to deliver that rig to an animator that also has to put it in similar poses. So if they had to adjust 1,000 little things, well, then either the rig needs to change or the model needs to change to make the rig easier. But if they could do it without too much hassle, it means an animator could do it without too much hassle. So to get final approval for the final approval for the character is the model and the rig together. Um, so DreamWorks does something like that where they sort of do that with a series of animation tests. So it's not really hitting the pose per se, but it's getting to a series of similar poses They don't try to be as exact. Uh, and the way that they got rid of that at Pixar, I think, is they actually, the character TD and the modeler are the same person.
Oh,
So you have to be a good sculptor or modeler, and you have to know how to rig. And those
okay.
are the same. Those are the same person, right? So every studio is a little bit different. Um, but anyway, back to this. There's a rhythm to the way that these details work, right? And what I mean is this character. So here in the mouth, right, we can see that there's a bunch of edges here at the corner of the mouth. Oops, sorry. Let's move this up here. Cooperate. So we can see there's some edges here at the corner of the mouth. And then even that spreads out to how these little wrinkles crack and fold, right? And you can see almost like a little shape that echoes out of that shape. There's a rhythm in nature to all of this stuff. The head moves up and down like that, just like our fingers move up and down, and we've got creases at the bottom of our fingers. Well, there's echoes of that movement, right? It's like throwing a stone in water. You get echoes of that movement over and over and over again, right? Same idea. So as I'm laying down detail on this guy, even the detail I think about as primary, secondary, tertiary. So even though this is a detail that lives inside of other shapes, we have our big primary shapes, we have our secondary shape of the mouth, right, and the jawline that lives inside that shape. Even now, I'm adding technically tertiary shapes. I'm not going to go in and add all the tiny ones right away. I'm going to add bigger tertiary shapes. And technically, excuse me, they're only tertiary shapes because they live inside of those other shapes, right? So now I can sort of do that. And same idea around the sort of bottom of the neck, I'm going to have shapes that basically live there and do that and start to make that almost cell pattern, right? Same thing here. Same thing here at the back of the nostril, where a nostril might flare up every once in a while, or you might have the mouth be broken up into different sections, right? So this is sort of my next level of detail. And honestly, this is the part where I'll just put on some music, get a cup of coffee and just go to town for a couple of hours, right? But I'll do the big shapes like this first and then do a quick pass of, there's a line here and a line here. That means they're different forms. Again, every form needs an apex. And it seems like this is sort of overkill, but I promise it's one of the things when you go to the movies and you look at, I don't even mean necessarily an animated film, you could look at a visual effects film, right? So, for example, every time I do a talk like this, I always bring up a few people, right? You look at Geo Nakpil or Raf Cressetti or people like this. And what you'll notice is when you look at their models, this is never neglected, this part, right? This part is super duper important. So, what I would recommend is sort of get used to settling into this idea that this part can really sort of help you, right? So if I'll just do this here, but I would take the time to do this to each section, right? But I'll just do it to that part just for speed. And now I'm at a point where I'm ready to add a lot of detail, and I want to try and do it as quickly as I can. ZBrush does have a layer system. It's a little finicky, but I'm going to say let's put this at that number of polygons. So it's 888,000. So it's almost a million. And I'm going to make a new layer, right? And I'm going to name it, and I'll say scales, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my standard brush, and I'm going to set it to Z add, right? So I can sculpt. But I can also choose how I want to sculpt, right? So I can say drag dots on the model, or I can say, let's get this drag rectangle, right? And what drag rectangle will do, right now the model is, the brush is just a ball, right? But it'll let me drag that ball wherever I want. And in here, I can choose an alpha. So I have a bunch of alphas um, in here, sort of organized. And I can say skin and scales. And let's choose some scales. So there's like elephant skin, and somewhere over here there's like lizard skin and all kinds of stuff. These are old ones that actually used to come with ZBrush. They don't come with ZBrush anymore, but I still have them all. The packet of information that I give Monique to share with the people who attended, I'll include these. So if people want to use them, they can. And what I can do is now, when I click and drag, it's going to allow me to click and drag really quickly and add those scale patterns. And you can see, like, depending on how much I pull on the brush, I can choose the actual physical scale of those things. And if I go more detailed than I think I need, right, what I can do is come over here to the layer, and I can say, hey, turn that layer down a little bit. And I can adjust how much they show up, right? I can make another layer, and then now that layer is active, and I can come in here and say, all right, so I've got these scale patterns now in there. Let's go in and right on top of them, let's try to keep that same idea. Because they're already puffed up, I'm going to get some of that, where I was making the big shapes before and then adding back into them, because they're already sort of puffed up. Excuse me, let me take a sip of tea. Sorry about that. So because they're puffed up already, when I do stuff like adding in the little wrinkles here in the back of the neck, the scales just sort of go along for the ride, right? And each layer I can adjust their contribution. So that, in essence, is how a few hours of that is how you get to something like this. But because you have this and it's the same model as that, right? Now comes the really, really fun part. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to export it. So I'll just export it as an OBJ for now, and I'll put it right here on the desktop. And I'll call this Dino Head Low. And then I'm going to divide it up to 3.5 million, and I'm going to export that, and I'm going to call this Dino Head High. So we have both models there. And while that's exporting, because that's going to take a second, I'm going to go over and launch Substance Painter.
Okay, there was another question while that's launching.
Yep.
Do you find that technique faster than polygrouping and using the polygroup remesh? And they elaborated, saying Danny's technique of forcing Z remesher to create an edge loop by exaggerating detail lines. Do you find it faster than using the polygroup technique?
I don't use the polygroup technique. So when ZRemesher was first introduced, it didn't have some of those other features. So I just learned to do it this way. I was like, oh, I can trick it if I just do this, and I just have stuck with it. So I can't really speak authoritatively to whether or not it is better, but it works for me. So it's what I've been using. Um, so I'm going to say, give me a new file in here, and I'll set the texture resolution, and I will choose the model, right? So let's go right here to desktop. I'm going to choose my low head, right, like that. And it should load the model in here, hopefully. Cool, there it is, right? And Substance Painter is a program, if you haven't used it, it lets you use materials to create effects, right? So here's a gold material. And if I said, hey, there's going to be like a dust on top of the gold. The gold itself here is made up of the color, and we're used to thinking about textures, if you've worked for a little while with CG, as sort of a color texture, right? But this is not just color, it's everything about the material itself. So this is the color, the roughness, how rough the material is, right? So I can turn that up or down, and the less rough it is, the more shiny it is, right? And it's whether it's metallic or not. And all metalness really means is what is the color of the highlight, right? So if I take the roughness and turn it down like this, it's very shiny, but it's got a white highlight. And if I turn on metalness, metalness only ever means not that it's necessarily more reflective or whatever, it means that the highlight is the same color, right? I'm getting the same actual amount of reflectiveness, believe it or not, even though it looks more reflective, but it's the color of the highlight. So let's say I have that, and if I go ahead and add a new fill layer here, I can say, well, what is dust? Dust is very rough, it's not very shiny. Let's go ahead and make it sort of a gray dust, and then it's not metallic at all. So let's say I have that. And now I can add a mask here, and I can paint into that mask. So let's get a brush that's got a little bit of a breakup to it. And now every place that that brush paints, you can see it's going to look like dust on top of the model. Why? Because I've defined the basic parameters of dust and the basic parameters of that metal. Now, later on, if someone says, I don't want that to be gold, I want it to be some other kind of metal, I can find the actual color value for that metal. And I can say, okay, cool, well, let's do that. And if they say, oh, I want the dust to be, I don't know, whatever, drips of blood instead. I promised Monique I wouldn't add blood to this dinosaur, but I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But now you can choose how shiny the blood is. You can add height information to it, right? So you can say the blood has a little bit of thickness to it. So you can sort of choose. You're basically making, the reason it's called substance painter is because you're making a bunch of different substances and then painting how they mix. But you can do more than just paint it, right? So if I go here, I can say, you know what? Let's add. So I'm going to take the texture set settings here and just sort of pull them into their own window. And what I can do is I can say, where are you? There we go. So bake mesh maps, and I'm going to say, let's bake them at 2048, and I'm going to add the high res model, which should have finished exporting by now. And actually, the first bake, I'll do them low res, so we can get through this part quickly. And I'm just going to say bake default mesh maps, and it's going to take a minute. And what it's doing is it's doing that calculation that I drew out before. It's saying, hey, within whatever the specified distance is, take the UV from the model, and on the model, right? So on my cheek, if I have another copy of myself with a bunch of little bumps, I can go ahead and say project out. And if I see another mesh that has information, grab that information and wrap it into my texture, right? So if we look, it's really low res right now because I only baked at 256. But if I go like that, here's the UVs of my model, and there's all the information. So I'm going to go back now and rebake, but I'm only going to rebake the normal map. So I'll turn everything back off, and this should go relatively quickly. And we should see a much higher resolution version of, oh, sorry. Let's do that. And let's do that actually too. So I'm going to bake those. It's going to take a minute. Yeah, there we go. And now we get a much higher resolution of our normal map, right? So we now have that low res model. So this is how video games basically do it. We have that low res model, and we have the high res looking result. And I can use that information in how I mix different textures, right? So if I have one texture here or one material here, and we say that that material is red metal, some kind of weird red metal, right? So I'm going to take that and do that. And then I make another material, and I say this is going to be yellow, and it's going to be very rough, like that. Then now what I can do is I can right click in here and say add bitmap mask, and those textures that I just baked, one of them is called the curvature, for example. So I can grab the curvature texture, and basically if I look at this mask by itself, I can hold Alt and click on it and look at the mask. That's what it looks like. And just like in Photoshop, I can add levels to turn the mask up or down in terms of color, right? Or value rather. And what that's going to do is it's going to make that yellow show through more or less, right? And I can even invert this. So I can say invert mask. And now the yellow only shows up in the crevices, and I can still use this levels to get it to sort of clamp the values, right? So I'm crushing how many shades of gray I can have to determine how this mixes. And if at any point someone says, No, that bottom part looks too much like a Christmas tree ornament. Change it. All right, well, you want it to be green and you want it to be way less metallic and you want it to be very rough or very shiny or whatever, right? So when you have enough of those layers sort of built up, you get this. Let's go. So that little error just says, hey, you made this file with an older version of the program. Are you sure you want to open it? Because you can't go back. And in this case, yes, I do. So now I can, let's turn off these other texture sets. I'll just work with the head here. So now here's the head, and there are all the UVs for the teeth and the head and the eyeballs, right? And you know, if we look at the individual layers, right, we can see the teeth, the eyes, the caruncula. So the caruncula is the little like tear ducty, little squishy pink thing at the corner of your eye. And if you say, let's look at the skin, then I've got the skin broken down into different parts, right? So I've got a base color, which is way too bright. And then I've got an underskin, and inside the underskin, I've got a whole bunch of information. And you might recognize some of this. If I hit C on the keyboard so we could just see the raw color, you might recognize some of these choices as coming directly from the reference that we used in the beginning, right? So some of the same ideas and choices and sort of color palette, I'm looking at all of what nature gives me because I can't out nature, right? So, and then, the top skin, same thing. It's made up of a whole bunch of sort of different levels that you can basically, I'm painting masks for each one of these, right? So it's just defining the way that the material works and then painting to reveal where I want to show it, right? That's really all Substance is. At the very, very end, you can export all your textures. You can bring them over into Marmoset. And in Marmoset, when you're all done, right? So in Marmoset, I've added some lights. I have a tutorial on my website that shows how the lights are added to a scene like this. In Marmoset, I've added some lights and I've applied the different materials. And at the end of it, I can say File, Export Model. I can say Export as a Marmoset viewer. And if I want, I can upload it directly to ArtStation, to my ArtStation page. It'll ask me to log in and it'll show me all my ArtStation projects, whatever. And if I go to my ArtStation page, this actual asset is here and you can see images of it or whatever. What's great about Marmoset is if a prospective employer or just some other art nerd comes, they can actually move this thing around the same way you can in Marmoset in the web page, because Marmoset exports directly to the web. And if you want to get really nerdy and say, oh, I want to see the topology, or I want to see how the gloss map works, the thing that controls the shine, or the normal map, or any of it, you can see it right here in this web setting. And it's not exactly as good as what you see in the actual Marmoset viewer because it's got to be fast enough for the web, but it's good enough, right? So it's like a pretty good sort of approximation. And if you go to my site and you go over to the blog section, inside here you see a bunch of information about Substance Painter, about making models. Here's the lighting one where I use this little goblin dude to make the lighting. I also do a lot of sculpting in VR. So this is like a little, if you have an Oculus, you put on the VR goggles and you can walk in through a little sculpture gallery. This is not my original idea. There's artists that are way better than me that did this first, and I liked it, and I was like, I'm stealing that. So I did my version of it with a bunch of old sculpts that I've done. But that's pretty much it. I know we're hitting, it's like a little after 5. Um,
Yeah, we had another question. I would
yeah, I got time if you got time.
okay, so I'll
Yeah.
just put this on for anybody else who may have we also have this. As an artist, do you enjoy creating exaggerated character creatures more, or do you enjoy making a model look as realistic as possible?
I can't out nature, so I think I think a bit of exaggeration is the thing I like to do because, um, so if you look at the time from when I started to now, right? The ability, there's a app on your phone, 123D Catch or whatever, where you can go and scan things right away, right? And it'll give you a scan of the model and a texture that's photogrammatically wrapped on the model or whatever, with halfway decent UVs that you can then use to sort of model with, right? As that technology has gotten better and better, and as people have scanned the real world more and more, pretty soon I'm fairly certain that it's going to be tougher. And I think you see it already. It's tougher and tougher to get jobs where you have to model something from scratch that has the fidelity of a scan. And to get there is very, very difficult. And it's never really appealed to me that much. So for me, doing something that I can't find in the natural world is more appealing from a job security standpoint, but also from a point of interest, because I know if I sat there and I really, really concentrated for a long time, I could get a reasonable proximity or facsimile, sorry, of a thing. But as soon as I look at that next to the real thing, I'm going to immediately start to notice differences, right? So, for me personally, I don't have a desire to do that. But I will say this: I also, and this is just a personal opinion to all of you, I also have no desire to allow the industry to define exactly who I am, right? So what I mean is, I see a lot of people with good work and sometimes bad work or medium work or whatever that define themselves as a 3D artist or a 2D artist or whatever. And I try not to be any of those things. I just try to be a good artist and just say it's the right color or the right shape or the right value. And I feel like if I can do that, then I have a chance of growing and getting better. You do need to have a certain level of focus to do a job. So like right now, I'm doing a lot of modeling and a little bit of visual development, right? So I need to be good at modeling and I need to be good at the technical aspects related to modeling to keep my job, right? So that's just part of it. But every time I'm doing more modeling at work, I come home and I draw a lot. And every time I'm doing more drawing at work, I come home and I model things. And that's just the way that my brain sort of modulates. I don't want to I, when I was first starting, I saw matte painters that got phased out because they were painting on pieces of glass and they were putting those behind people in live action shoots. And that eventually gave way to the technology that birthed Photoshop. And those people got so wrapped up in, well, that's not art and I don't want to do that or whatever. And then they went to go drive trucks or do whatever else they want to do, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, there were some people that said, okay, cool. Well, I'm a painter and I paint and I was doing it this way. And now I need to take all that knowledge and soak it up and apply it to this new thing, right? Right now I'm learning Blender and it's a little bit of a struggle for me, but I know enough about making a model, lighting a thing, rendering a thing, all the key things that I just need to learn the procedure to do it in this new program because I think the industry is really leaning that way in a lot of areas. And if I don't, I'll be phased out like those other people. I see people already, friends of mine, that are like, it's not as good as ZBrush. Well, I'm trying to do one sculpt every day in Blender. And that's sort of my goal for the next couple of months. And some of them are horrific, but already I'm getting familiar enough where I'm starting to get used to it. And eventually, if it replaces ZBrush, I don't care because I know it, right? So that's sort of the way I try to think about it. Be flexible and grow your mind as an artist. Don't allow the industry to say, okay, well, this is the job opportunity you have today, and that's going to define you for your life. You know, if you really, really like it and you want to call yourself, I'm a 3D modeler and I don't have any interest in that other stuff, that's cool, but be prepared. If you do realistic 3D models or cartoony 3D models, be prepared for the industry to shift different
Mhm.
tools, different ideas, and you better be ready to shift with it. You know, so because I've seen it do it a bunch. ZBrush came around and it basically wiped a bunch of people off the board because they were like, "Oh, that's not real sculpture or it's not real modeling or whatever," and a lot of people just are gone. So, and I saw it happen. It was terrible. So yeah.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, we just went over time by just a little bit, but I see this came in
Yeah.
from a co-founder has been holding it down on social media, and in the comments, she said people are still RSVPing on Eventbrite, and thank you to everyone that's on social media saying how great this is. This is just the first. This will not be the last of these kind of demos that we're doing, and we are so grateful to have Danny. We have another comment. Blender sculpting was much easier for me than ZBrush.
Oh
I love
yeah.
hearing all this talk about Blender. I feel very encouraged to check it out myself. I do want to just add in that a download link will be sent out to everyone that registers. So if you missed the beginning, if you missed whatever, if you left early, it doesn't matter. Everyone that registers, even after it started, will get the link. Danny has provided some bonus material that will also be sent out. The video on YouTube will only be available for about 2 weeks, but that's why we felt this was very important to send out as well.
Yeah.
So, we will be signing out now, but thank you to everyone to take your time this Saturday and, just like nerd out with us. This was really great and informative.
Sweet, thank you. Real quick, this
Yeah.
is what I have on my screen right now is the actual bonus material, right? So I went through with the same exact sort of setup and did sort of three quick. So this is real time, and I'm talking over it or whatever. It's about a half an hour of three different shapes for an astronaut, and then the blocking out of that astronaut. Sorry, let me turn down the volume. The blocking out of that astronaut then in 3D, and then typically the kind of thing that I do at work a lot, then going through and doing a little paint over of that as a time lapse. Um, and the paint over is basically what ends up getting presented at the end for selling the idea of the character, right? So you get those three videos. I'll throw in my sort of ZBrush preference stuff, and the slides from the beginning, and then I'll send you all that tonight, Monique, and then you can pass it out to folks.
Okay. So, we'll just say bye, guys. Take care,
See
and
you.
we'll
Thank
see
you.
y'all soon. Yes.